Hello and welcome to the program. I'm David Spears. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight, and joining me on the panel, the CEO of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, Diana Sayed, Afghanistan veteran and Victoria Cross recipient Daniel Keighran, international security expert Lydia Khalil, Nationals MP Darren Chester, who until recently was the Minister for Veterans Affairs, the former Labor Foreign Minister Bob Carr, and joining us live from London for the first part of tonight's program, the BBC's Yalda Hakim, who brought you tonight's foreign correspondent. It is great to have you all here.
I am a young Hazara, born in Afghanistan and fled to Australia in 2006. With the Taliban making countless vague and empty promises, such as not taking away the rights of women and girls from getting an education or having the right to work, simply because the whole world is watching them right now. What is the Australian government's plan once the Taliban reneges on their alleged promises, especially once the world turns away its attention from Afghanistan in a few days, a few weeks, or a few months?
Yalda, let me start with you on this. You have actually spoken to Taliban representatives as part of that extraordinary piece we saw tonight on Foreign Correspondent. And you also took an unexpected call the other day while you were live on air on the BBC from a Taliban spokesman as well, who told you there will be no revenge on anyone. Can the assurances we're hearing from the Taliban really be believed?
Well, David, you saw that extraordinary press conference that the Taliban had a few days ago. It was very similar to what I've heard the Taliban say before. They said it to me on air. They said it to me face-to-face when I travelled to Doha. They said that women would have their rights. There wouldn't be any revenge attacks or reprisals. But I spent the better part of 3 weeks in Afghanistan a few weeks ago, and you saw that report on Foreign Correspondent. And I sat down with Taliban frontline commanders who are fighting this war at the moment. And I asked him a series of questions, and he said to me, we want to return to the kind of rule that we had in the 90s. So when I asked about, for example, if a woman was accused of adultery, now adultery based on whose judgment, he said, well, of course we would have stonings. He said we would have public executions, use sort of soccer stadiums to do that kind of thing. There would be amputation of hands and feet if someone were to commit the crime of theft. He said, this is all laid out in the Quran. This is all part of our Sharia law. And if you want to live within it, great. If not, you'll face the kind of reprisals that you need to.
So, Diana, what do you think about this talk of some sort of Taliban 2.0?
Yeah, well, exactly that, David. It's just talk. The ideological sort of mentality hasn't shifted. What has is that they've got a very sophisticated PR machine now, and they've now got social media at their disposal. Just because that they've got a spokesperson and they're able to use Twitter doesn't necessarily erase the ideology, their stance on women's rights, on how they will continue to persecute other minority groups and others at risk in the country. I don't trust anything that they're actually now spinning.
Lydia, does the Taliban need international support, engagement more than it once did? And indeed, do you think this is an organisation capable of reforming?
Well, I think it's an important question, and I think the points Diana made are spot on, is that, the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. And we only have to look at what the Taliban did in the 90s when they originally came to power. They said exactly the same things. They said there won't be any reprisals, we won't go door to door, our rule will not be brutal. But then we saw what happened. They governed according to this archaic and brutal Islamic rule that, frankly, many of the world's Muslims do not consider as legitimate.
Yes.
And so, to me, we should not be expecting any significant change. Saying that, however, they certainly do, for the time being, do crave international legitimacy. They need the aid that's coming in. And so they're going to be making the right noises at the moment. But again, their ideology hasn't changed. Their vision for Afghanistan hasn't changed, and we shouldn't expect it to.
So, Bob Carr, coming back to Mustafa's question, if once this global spotlight moves on, moves away, and we do see the Taliban revert to what we've always known about them, what then should countries like the US and Australia do?
Well, it's got to be said that their rule in Afghanistan between 1996 and 2002 was monstrous. There were massacres, along with all the institutionalised systemic cruelties towards women and girls. There are two things we've got to focus on given the limitation on any impact we can have. One is reopening our embassy as soon as possible, and doing so moving in partnership with like-minded countries, the Europeans, the Canadians. The Americans would certainly want us to have eyes and ears in Kabul as resumed as soon as possible. Obviously, we've got to move as if the promise of international engagement will make the leadership of the Taliban aware of the impact on world opinion of any return to the abuses that they practiced so monstrously, so systemically, 1996 to 2002. The other thing is to use our relationships with certain nations in the Arab world, with Pakistan, to send messages to the Taliban leadership. Again, reminders that the world is watching. They can isolate themselves from the world if they want, but there will be costs and penalties associated with that. I know all this sounds pretty lame, but the end of our military presence there means that our options are very much limited.
Well, Darren, just let me just cut to the chase on that point. Whether it's engaging back in Afghanistan with an embassy, engaging Pakistan and other regional neighbours, is the bottom line. Even if we see human rights atrocities under the Taliban in Afghanistan, we're not sending troops back in.
Well, David, I agree with your earlier speakers that the Taliban will be craving legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. But we have every right to be very sceptical about any change in behaviour. I mean, if we're going to see change, we need to see it now. And the first example of that would be allowing clear passage for people who are seeking to leave, who have visas to leave, who are seeking to access the airport and seeking to be repatriated to a safer location. That would be the first sign that the Taliban is serious about behaving differently this time compared to last time. But I have no confidence that we'll see any improvement in behaviour.
So if we don't?
The attitude towards women and children and minority groups.
So if we don't, though, the bottom line is we're not going back in.
Well, David, that's not a decision you can expect me to make as a backbencher in Gippsland.
You can have a view.
The reason we first engaged in Afghanistan all those years ago, which I'm sure we'll get to during tonight's conversation, was around preventing it becoming a haven for basing global terrorism attacks. It morphed into a different role in following years, and it became a nation-building role to some extent. So we're not likely, as we sit here today, to be talking about Australian military presence other than what we're seeing right now, which is that humanitarian effort to repatriate Australians and visa holders, people who have worked with the coalition forces and in fact saved lives on the ground in Afghanistan over these past 20 years by the work they've done with the Australian and coalition forces.
And we will come to that, but Yalda, just coming back to you on this, is the Taliban aware of this reality, that the US and its allies are not going to return there simply because, or only because, of human rights atrocities that it might commit?
Yes, they are aware of this, and the conversations I had with them in Doha and Afghanistan was that we are not going to turn Afghanistan into some kind of terrorist haven. The issues of human rights and women's rights, that memo hasn't trickled down to the foot soldiers and the commanders, but one thing that has been passed right round is you make it clear that you in no way are affiliated with groups like Al-Qaeda, for example. But we know from the assessments of US intelligence, US Treasury, the UN, that continue to put out reports as early as just a few months that the Taliban are still very much linked and protecting Al-Qaeda in the country. I'm also getting reports from people who are in the provinces. They're sending me videos and photographs of foreign fighters in the country. Of course, as the BBC and as all journalists, we have to ensure that we verify the authenticity of those videos. But these are the sorts of things that are now starting to emerge, where even residents of Kabul are saying to me they're hearing foreign languages and they're seeing fighters from places like Yemen, Iraq, Syria operating in the country. So as Bob Carr said there, that it's quite important that the international community at least has the presence of their diplomatic staff in the country as eyes and ears.
My name is Taz, and I belong to the Hazara community group from Afghanistan. I came to Australia in 2013 as an unaccompanied minor to seek asylum because my life was in danger. That year, Australia changed its immigration policy for people arriving by boat, ensuring we never get permanent protection, nor will we ever be able to bring our family here. Almost 9 years has gone, and I'm still living in limbo. My future is uncertain, but one thing I do know is that I will never be able to return under Taliban rule. So where does that leave me and my family back in Afghanistan? I am 25 years old, and I already have lost contact with my three sisters. Aziza, Habiba, and Najiba are human beings. They are smart, beautiful, and kind. How can this government, who knows the might and terror the Taliban bring, just sit and watch as we experience yet another genocide of innocent people?
Well, Diana, let me come to you first on this. Taz, we heard there, he's on a temporary protection visa. He's been on it for nearly 9 years. The Prime Minister has made it clear there will be no permanent visas for those who did come by boat. We have received a lot of questions about this from members of the Afghan community. What is it like, as far as you're aware, being on a temporary visa? What does that mean?
Yeah, and I just would like to say thank you, Taz, for your question. I see you, and I can not even imagine what that is like to be on a temporary protection visa in Australia, living your life in limbo like that. There are over 5,100 Afghans currently here in Australia, living amongst us, working, shopkeepers, doctors, lawyers, working amongst us in our neighbourhoods who are on temporary protection visa. And that is also one of our calls in our open letter, in our petition. We are also calling for those 5,100 people who, mainly from the Hazara minority group, who don't have a pathway to permanent residency. Now, it is so important that they be granted that, because it is clear from everything that has happened in the last week that the Taliban resurgence, they cannot be given much deference right now around this rhetoric that they are spinning, and they should be granted permanent protection. Well,
Darren, Chester, is it time to give someone like Taz a permanent visa?
Well, David, you know and I know how incredibly complex this issue has proved to be. And you were in the press gallery and I was in the backbench in opposition when Question Time was a daily report on the number of boats arriving unlawfully in our country. And what the Prime Minister has said and made it very clear, we won't be outsourcing our refugee, our humanitarian, our visa program to people smugglers. We won't give them a product to sell.
But do TPVs do that? I mean, there's boat turnbacks and so on and offshore processing, but do TPVs do that?
What we know, David, from the last experience when we lost control of our borders under the previous government, was that people smugglers are waiting for every small chink in our armour and to be able to go to the unfortunate souls who are seeking to travel and to sell them a product that they can come to Australia and they'll get permanent residency. And we saw people dying at sea, and there is nothing humane about sending our Navy, our border protection people out to fish bodies from the water as they had to do when we lost control of our borders. We can't see that return.
I would just like to correct that.
I'm sorry, the Prime Minister made it very clear. The Prime Minister made it very clear today that people who arrived unlawfully will not be in a position to achieve permanent residency under this government.
They have actually been determined as genuine refugees. They've already gone through the process, and there is no pathway to them to permanent residency. Now, where is the human rights in that? Where is the humanity in that these people have to live their lives in limbo, which means that they can't have family reunification, which means that Taz can't have his sisters, his parents, his siblings come out to Australia? Where is the dignity in that? I ask of you, I ask of everyone in Australia right now, how you could fathom living your life like that.
Bob Carr, let me just get your thought on that.
Yeah, David. I'm the first to concede that people smugglers should not be setting the pace in Australian immigration. It's a position I'd taken when I was in federal politics, and I supported Kevin Rudd's initiative with offshore processing and offshore detention, and boat turnbacks has worked. Full marks to the Abbott government. With those policies in place, however, there's no reason to worry about an inadvertent message to people smugglers by doing something that captures the generosity with which Bob Hawke moved in 1989 in the wake of Tiananmen, letting them stay. It seemed almost flamboyantly generous at the time. many of these students could have returned safely to China. But he didn't take the risk. He erred on the side of generosity. I am convinced from what I've seen of the Afghan community in Australia, Hazaras stand out. I've met a lot of them, that there is not the faintest risk of the nefarious trade in human beings being resumed, because after all these years, we legitimise the people who've got TBV status. Err on the side of generosity. These people have been fantastically successful additions to this country's multicultural strength. Legitimise it, while at the same time allowing the offshore processing and detention policy and the boat turnbacks to take care of the problem, a real problem. I don't retreat from that of people smuggling. It will not revive because of reform of because of the legitimisation of people with TPVs.
I just want to say that, David, that I think it's like we have to sit here and constantly prove our humanity to be given our basic human rights. And we have signed on to the United Nations Refugees Convention. We have obligations at international law. And you can't forget that the Afghan diaspora that is in Australia right now, we have over 46,000 of us, 71,000 including the children of Afghans. This is a core constituency base. And our history in this nation dates back to the Afghan Cameliers that have come back in the 1800s. So we have been pivotal in nation building here, but we shouldn't have to prove our humanity. This is an international law obligation.
Our next question, which comes from the former military intelligence officer known as Witness J, whose identity remains suppressed. J served in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan, and was trialled and sentenced in secret for national security offences. So we obviously can't identify him, but the question from Witness J, the veteran community is hurting deeply at the moment. I am hurting, he says. Our pain is only a drop in the bucket to what many Afghans are feeling. Before my deployment to Afghanistan a decade ago, our commanding officer told us Australia's involvement was to assure the US that we were a dependable ally, and that once we left, the Afghan government was likely doomed to fail. Given this, he says, why couldn't our political leaders tell the country the obvious truth, that we were there solely to prove to the US that should the time come, we would fight with them so that they may intervene on our behalf in any future existential military crisis. Lydia, is supporting the United States, supporting that alliance, one of, if not the main reason we went in, and is it a legitimate reason?
It's certainly one of the main reasons that Australia's involvement in Afghanistan. It's not the only one. I think that Australia did have legitimate concerns about international terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. Australian interests and Australian people have been targeted by al-Qaeda and international jihadists that came out of there. So I think they were both important reasons for Australia's involvement in Afghanistan to begin with. And I think that they were both equally legitimate. But I think that once the mission creep started to happen, once we started to see the limitations of that military involvement, you know, the truth of that and the limitations of that should have been properly understood and factored in to Australia's involvement in Afghanistan.
Daniel, let me just ask you on that. Is that why you felt you were there as well?
For me, look, that's pretty simple. I was there for the men and women to the left and to the right of me on the ground. It's as simple as that. I went, they went, we served our country. The government of the day, I have no questions at all of why we went, or no issues for why we went across there. At the start of the program, you know, I said that I fought beside the Afghan National Army as well. For me, it was absolutely about human rights. You know, those friends that I have or had whilst I was in country, the Afghan National Army. You know, for me, it was about creating a better tomorrow for them. So yes, there was a number of issues throughout. That's without a doubt. I'm, for one, who's been in combat and situations like that, that every step that you could take could be your last. I'm not going to sit here and question some of the decisions that were made. But let's be honest, mistakes were made.
Do you ever feel, though, Daniel, as though while you're on the ground there, that politics was holding back what you were able to do, was getting in the way of doing what you needed to do?
Politics or resources, depends on how you want to look at this problem. Without a doubt, more resources on the ground, I think our mission would have been vastly different to what we achieved. I think we could have achieved so much more if we had the resources available to do that.
If I could interject here, David, I think, you know, with all due respect to the veteran community out there who are genuinely feeling this and the pain is palpable, and they have also signed on to our petitions calling for the humanitarian intake. You know, they've been platformed quite extensively, but I just worry about how the experiences of Afghans are once again being sidelined. We did not choose for this war to happen. It's an imperialist intervention that was unlawful in 2001 following 9/11.
You're saying that intervention would have been better had there not been an intervention?
We just need to be mindful of this narrative. It's very, it's become quite simplistic and a binary between the Taliban and the intervention and allied forces. We can sit here and hold a multifaceted approach. We as Afghans can sit here and critique our own government for a plethora of reasons, for corruption or, you know, war profiteering. We can sit here and also critique the intervention and allied forces and what has transpired in the last 20 years since the intervention. Yes, gains were made once that intervention happened, undeniably so, that is a fact. However, since then, you know, we don't want the Taliban either. So we can have all of these feelings, and as well, it's not one or either or situation. My point is that, you know, we have to actually take stock of where we are in history right now. Have we learned anything from this intervention? Do we want to go back to another 20 years, 30 years, another Iraq, another Taliban 2.0, another Afghanistan? And this is where Australia does have to reassess its foreign policy priorities and interests, to go into another war and see our war veterans who are clearly in pain. Absolutely, but the Afghans are too.
Absolutely.
We have experienced collective trauma, intergenerational trauma. I've never even known my grandparents. My parents are so foreign in terms of how they've been able to flee as refugees in the middle of the night. And in all of this, the voices of Afghans consistently and continuously gets drowned out. And I just want to be really mindful that we need to be centred, our experiences need to be centred, and our voices need to be heard right now.
Well, David, I think something, I think something needs to be said here, and that is, it's very hard to imagine that Australia would not have entered the war in Afghanistan. Despite it ended up being a coalition of over 40 nations. All of NATO was there. It was said to be the biggest coalition in history. The issue really is the mission creep, turning it from a war to take out Al-Qaeda, to banish them for good, to eliminate their camps, to create a situation where there was some help to the development of a central government that had authority in Kabul that would not allow the Taliban to take over again. But it turned out to be a very drawn-out, a very attenuated process, and the mission changed. In fact, the mission was rather vague. It was George Bush saying, America will be there, America will never give up. It became that most dangerous of things for America, that is, an attempt to prove its dominance. And as with the Vietnam War, America's leadership carried on, as the Afghanistan papers are now confirming, carried on the war knowing it couldn't achieve any reasonable strategic objectives. Yeah. It kept the war going as it kept Vietnam going, and that really was a tragedy.
Despite what we were told, Lydia.
Could I just make an interjection? With all due respect to the need to centre Afghan voices on this, I mean, it's not correct to say that this was an illegal intervention. This is one that got the approval of the United Nations, was as a coalition, as was mentioned before. This was a justified intervention at the beginning that had the approval and the support of a large coalition and the approval of the United Nations Security Council. But as we saw, and has been already mentioned, so I won't belabor it, you know, all of that has been lost at the length of this war. It's been 2 decades. And at the certain point, you know, it was clear that we were not achieving what we needed to achieve. But it's important to clarify, though, that initial...
At the outset, it did have the UN Security Council backing for the ISAF mission. Look, I do want to point out, and Darren Chester touched on this earlier, if this discussion, and particularly for veterans, but for anyone really, whether it has raised issues for you, and we know members of the Afghan community too, as Diana has has pointed out the numbers for Lifeline and Open Arms are there on your screen, so please give those a call.
Hi, my question is for the Afghanistan experts on the panel. As an Australian, I feel responsible for the mess that's been created by the 20-year war in their country. What I'd like to know is how can we, average Australians, do something to help our fellow human beings who won't be able to leave Afghanistan no matter how much they might want to? What can we do from here that will actually have an impact?
I want to get a very quick final thought, if we can, from everybody on the panel on this one. What can individuals do who are concerned about what they've seen this week? Diana.
I just would caution these sorts of buying into the narrative that somehow, it's a very racist colonial trope that is deeply rooted in Islamophobia. And so there is a lot that we can do. Don't buy into the security lens narrative, the fear-mongering and the dog whistling to people saying that Afghans are X, Y and Z. We are people. There is so much that you can do, and Australia has a moral imperative and obligation to us to actually show up in our time of need, because we have been sold out and let down for many decades now. So, and with all due respect, Lydia, it's very important that from an Afghan to our experience to be centred. But I really think that you can do so much. You can sign on to letters to your MP, you can sign the petition, you can do so much on social media under Action for Afghanistan and actually mobilise around this issue.
Daniel, Sonia's question, what can individuals do to have an impact if they're concerned?
Okay, so for me, this is going to be very veteran-focused, clearly. As a veteran of Afghanistan, multiple tours, I would say to the veteran community that have experienced concern, certainly from the scenes from Kabul just recently, if you do need help, as Darren Chester mentioned before, Open Arms are there to support you. So please reach out if required.
All right, Lydia?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, one, open your wallets if you can. There's a lot of good organizations on the ground that are trying to do the best they can in Afghanistan. I think contacting your local MPs, particularly MPs that are currently in government, to signal that there is support in Australia for an increased humanitarian intake. And not only that, because that there will be a narrative out there saying that Australians don't want more, that they can't handle more. And so, signal your support for that to counter that argument. And also keep sustained attention, because this is going to be moving, the media cycle moves on, people move on, there's no shortage of misery in the world. If you really do care about Afghanistan, keep your attention on what's going on.
Well, it was at times over the last 20 years called the Forgotten War, more than a few times. Darren Chester.
Thanks, David, and thank you for your panel. And my message will be a pretty simple one. Let's not talk Australia down. Let's not say that this 20 years was wasted. Daniel Keighran talked about the smiles on children's faces. There was hope and there was optimism. A chance was created. It hasn't ended in a way we expected in recent times. But Australians can be proud of the fact that we do have a humanitarian refugee program. As I said at the outset, 920,000 people have come to Australia after World War II. We will do our bit. We'll continue to do our bit. We are a proud nation, and in its many diverse ways, we've got to keep working together, support each other. We've got a lot of our own challenges right now in Australia as well, and we need to keep working together as a community, and being good global citizens is part of that.
And finally, Bob Carr, to you.
The humanitarian intake, I think that's the most obvious obligation on us, to send a message to Canberra that we can be generous and do ourselves a favour by boosting the intake from Afghanistan of people who are going to be struggling and in distress and under threat. One other thing, just a thought, for people, including people with veterans' backgrounds, people who are just thinking about what the international personality of this country should be, why not entertain the idea that before any military commitment is made in future for us to join a war elsewhere on the globe, we have at least a debate in the House of Representatives. Not a binding vote, perhaps, not a debate in the Senate, but at least in the People's House, a debate. Don't forget the US Constitution says the Congress makes war and peace decisions. We don't have that constitutional provision here, but at least saying as a matter of practice, before any future military commitment, we'll have a debate in the House of Representatives.
We might need another hour to debate that particular idea, but we thank you for putting it forward this evening, Bob Carr. That is all we have time for. Please thank our panel, Diana Syed, Daniel Keighran, Lydia Khalil, Darren Chester and Bob Carr. And thank you for all those stories and questions that we've heard tonight. Next week, Virginia Trioli brings you a Q&A youth special, looking at the rising rate of infection in young people. On the panel, Dr Norman Swan and paediatrician Dr Anthony Rhodes. They'll be joining students Patria Havadas and Arth Tateja. And I'll see you on Sunday morning on Insiders. The Prime Minister will be my guest. Stay safe. Good night.